I want to talk to you guys today about a question that comes up a lot, and it's something that I have thought about myself for a long time, in fact many years. The question is, can urban farms feed the world? And I've got some very different opinions on this, and I think you might be surprised by some of them. So the immediate question, can urban farms feed the world? Well, if we're talking about can they feed the world right now, no, not even close. Like, not even a fraction of the production of food comes from cities as it does from the country. So does that mean that it can be that way in the future? Well, no, it's certainly not. I mean, there's tons of development going into urban agriculture, myself being a person that's very involved in that. But when you look at simple output, it just doesn't even come close. And the other reason that that production isn't there now, and it won't be for the foreseeable future, is that in the city we're just very limited on what the types of food we can produce. So if you look at the whole human diet and what we need to eat, the things that I grow on my farm are a small fraction. They're a small piece of that pie. They're certainly part of it, but they're not the majority of it. So humans need a lot of proteins and complex carbohydrates. My farm grows a lot of fiber, right? I grow a lot of leafy greens and baby root vegetables and fruiting crops like tomatoes. But there's a whole other part of the diet that isn't being met by my farm. So my farm is a small piece of the pie. And so most of that comes from the countryside. And the other thing that is interesting about urban food development or urban farming and where money and research is being put into it is a ton of it is going into research and development on high-tech urban farms. So inner city, hydroponic, aquaponic, vertical type farms, expensive type operations where these operations cost millions of dollars to set up. So that's not to discredit those in any way. I think that's just as a valid of pursuit in agriculture as any other. But what those things don't do, and this is kind of where I see issues with, is that they don't speak to the culture of bringing back the family farm. And I think the family farm is a super integral part of North American tradition and sort of Western values of people who are producers and not consumers. So when you look at environmental problems, in my opinion, a lot of them have to do with the fact that more people consume. Because when you're just a consumer and you're not involved in any type of production, you don't see how things are produced. That means that you're somewhat disconnected from where things come from. It's like you ask the average kid in a city, where does food come from? They'll tell you that it comes from the grocery store. So there's a whole bunch of issues along with that. And I'm not even talking about climate change as an issue. I'm talking about straight up waste, like environmental waste. And a lot of that has to do with consumption. And so there is a huge culture in the world today, and I don't even think this is a controversial thing to say, it's quite mainstream in fact, that cities are consumers and the country, the rural areas, are producers, right? Just look at what people do in cities on average, and look at what people do in the countryside on average. Of course, there's exceptions on both ends. So the thing that I don't like about this trend, if we're talking about urban farming, where it's going, is if it's going towards high-tech, high capital intensive type farming, that might address some issues. It might address some environmental issues in that you don't have, if it's not a soil-based type farm, you're not degrading soil and so on and so forth, but you're not getting anybody else involved in agriculture. And the risk in that, I think, my speculation is that this will just continue on this culture of consumer culture because less people are involved in agriculture. I think it's a good thing if people have gardens. Not that a garden is really going to produce much in the grand scheme of things as far as food production. Like, you could have 1 out of every 10 homes in a city be gardens, and that's not really going to dent global food production at all. But it does affect the culture, and I think that's very important. I think the culture needs to change. If you look at trends in the world, you can see that the majority of people, I believe the UN did a study on this recently, the majority of people now live in cities. And cities is where people consume. And even if you look at the US election in the last, with Trump and Clinton, and that look at the geographical map of how those votes went down, it's very interesting. And I'm not going to go on about politics. My political views are irrelevant to this subject. But if you look at where the votes were, the conservatives were in the rural areas and the liberals were in the urban areas. So that is very interesting, because at the end of the day, the rural people feed the cities. And you know, we can talk about and speculate on all kinds of different forms of agriculture and how they'll change. But still, the fact of the matter is right now that the rural areas feed the urban areas. And I think urban agriculture has a bigger part to play in the changing of the culture. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in people in the cities learning how to produce food for themselves and acquire some level of self-reliance. And I'm not naive on how much actual self-reliance that changes. I know that it doesn't change that much, but it's the culture of when you know how food is created, you understand what's involved. Then you learn to make better value decisions on where you purchase. Because one thing people say to me is, hey Curtis, you're teaching all these people how to farm and garden. Aren't you worried about you're going to lose customers because they're all going to go out and garden? The actual opposite is true. And this is sort of an abundance versus scarcity type thinking that I addressed in my last video, in that the opposite is true. When people understand where their food comes from, when they know how difficult it is to grow a carrot during the summer, they're going to value that carrot a lot more. And when they don't have that carrot from their own garden, they're not going to bat an eye at paying a higher price to get it from a local organic farmer. So I think the culture is changing the perception of where food comes from and be willing to pay a better price for it. So I know I've sidetracked a little bit there because I wanted to address this issue of culture. But so in the immediate, to answer the question right off the bat, can urban feed the world? No, not even close, not anytime soon. However, it is possible that in time that will be. But I'm not so sure, even for myself, that I want it that way. I think the rural culture is an important part of North American heritage and Western culture, which I like Western culture. I'm super happy that I live in the West. And we have this culture of, bootstrap it, entrepreneurialism, go out and make it, go out and be a producer, go out and do something. If you don't like something you see in the world, go out and change it, not mail it in and just put the responsibility on somebody else. And that's the thing that I've seen, being somebody who is very liberal-minded myself and very urban. I lived in Montreal for many years. That attitude for myself has changed through my journey of being a farmer and my travels of visiting many farms throughout the world and seeing the reality of the situation, whereas I often disregarded rural people and condescended to rural people, which is something that I see happening in this trend with the political trends that are happening today, and I don't think that's a good thing, because at the end of the day, the rural feeds the city. And so again, that might change over time, but it certainly won't anytime soon. So I want to just address a little bit about what I see happening in rural agriculture, because I've talked a little bit about what's the trends on what's happening in urban. On the rural side, there is a lot of really cool development happening with this umbrella of regenerative agriculture. So going beyond sustainable. Sustainable, in my opinion, sounds quite boring. It's like, well, how's the relationship with your wife? Well, it's sustainable. That doesn't sound very exciting. But regenerative agriculture is an idea that a farm or a productive ecosystem type model will actually make that system better over time. It will regenerate the soil, it will build topsoil, it will increase its production while doing all kinds of other ecological good at the same time. That doesn't really seem to be happening so much in the urban. It's happening more in the rural when you're looking at perennial based farming systems, growing, intercropping, tree crops, things like this. Stefan Sokobiak, who I did an interview with, a friend of mine, he's involved in that. Holistic management, people like Joel Salatin and Alan Savory, and my friend Neil Spackman in the Middle East doing amazing work converting deserts to farming and ecosystems again. A lot of this type of development is happening on the rural context, not so much in the urban context. So, we'll talk about global food, populations increasing, how do we meet the food demands of those populations. There's no doubt that urban has a part to play. But when it really comes down to brass tacks on where the food is being produced, it is being produced in the rural areas. And it's going to be a long time until the urban can even make a dent in that, because you have to look at the diet, the human diet. What do we need to eat? There's many things we need to eat. A farm like mine really only produces fiber type crops like leafy greens, root vegetables, tomatoes. I'm not growing grains, I'm not growing proteins, I don't raise animals. It's not to say that I couldn't, but there's certainly no economics in raising cattle, dairy cows or meat cows in a city, right? That just doesn't make sense based on how much land is required for that type of agriculture. So urban just can't, even in the foreseeable future, in my opinion, meet that demand. However, there are trends right now, so I'll go back to urban a little bit. There are trends where urban agriculture is trying to meet these demands. So one thing is, in cities, in 10, 20 years, we might be eating bugs. We might be raising cockroaches and black soldier flies and worms and all kinds of stuff to meet our protein demands. So that is definitely a trend. In Asia, it's been around for a long time. It might happen. Western culture, I think, will be the last to adopt that. But I see it coming. I've met urban farmers myself that are already working on these ideas. Raising fish, certain types of aquaponics or aquaculture in the cities is certainly something that's in development. But again, not even close to denting the production that comes out of the rural areas. So, when you look at where the money, I mentioned this a little bit before, but where you look at where the money is going into urban agriculture as far as investment, it's going into the high-tech stuff. It's not going into farms like mine. And those high-tech farms don't have something that I like. And so this isn't really a point to this issue, but one thing that I really like that's a trend in today is this concept of decentralization. And we see it in technology, we see it in the economy, we even see it in politics in some countries, is that this idea of spreading out the risk and spreading out the power. And I like that idea. Somebody myself who's more politically on the libertarian anarchist type side of things, I like the idea of spreading out the power and spreading out the risk. These new types of farms are just centralizing what's already been centralized. Agriculture is already very centralized. When you look at mass production, industrial agriculture, it's super centralized to a few corporations that pretty much own most of these farms. If we go into this high-tech type of farming, it's the same model because it's highly capital intensive and it requires a ton of money and research and development to get those farms off the ground. So that doesn't make more farmers. That's another model of bigger farms and less farmers. Farms like mine, on the other hand, there isn't a lot of money going into them because they don't scale in the same way those operations do. And I believe me, I've been approached by dozens of investors who want to figure out a way to franchise my model and ramp it up and make it go all over the world. But there's a lot of logistical challenges to that because the farming is so decentralized. So, I've consulted on many projects for this and none of them have really gone anywhere. So if you're going to email me about that, take this at face value that I don't know. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere. But having said that, where it can go is more people getting involved. So not everybody has to be a farmer, and I think that's sort of my mission with this, is to get more people interested and engaged in agriculture. It doesn't have to mean that you're a farmer, but if we can understand agriculture better, I think we can make better choices. We can make better consumer choices, and we can reduce our waste. I think we can bring back some of the cultural good that comes out of people that are productive, comes from the farming attitude. I think that's a good thing. So those are my thoughts. Again, can urban farms feed the world? No, not right now, not anytime in the foreseeable future. I really value rural farms. I think it's important that these farms continue to feed the world and continue to feed cities because they bring a balance to the way that we live. And that balance of even different political ideology, that diversity of political ideology and culture, that's a good thing. I really do believe in diversity. But I think the part of diversity that's often missed when discussing politics is political diversity. You know, we've all accepted that it's great to have diversity of types of people, and that's all good. But we also need a diversity of attitude, political attitude, culture. This is good stuff. So I know I sidetracked a little bit there, but that is my thoughts on the issue.